ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Hello, ABC News Daily listeners. I'm Erin Park, host of the new podcast series Expanse, Nowhere Man, and we've got a special bonus episode available now. It turns out one of our key characters was not who he said he was.
Maybe he is really Tom Cruise in Mission Impossible.
This looks like a cartoon.
So who was Garrison Gunslinger Sinclair, and why did he die in mysterious circumstances in Mexico? Search and subscribe now to Expanse, Nowhere Man.
The Israeli leader, Benjamin Netanyahu, says Anthony Albanese is a weak leader who has betrayed Israel and abandoned Australia's Jews. But do we really need to be in lockstep with Israel as it broadens its assault on Gaza? Today, Global Affairs editor Laura Tingle on the dramatic slide in relations. I'm Sam Hawley on Gadigal land in Sydney. This is ABC News Daily. Laura, Benjamin Netanyahu has begun the mission to take over Gaza City. He really isn't listening to any of the international condemnation, is he?
He's not. And he's also not listening to an exceptional level of opposition to this manoeuvre within Israel either, Sam. I mean, we've seen those massive protests in Israel.
There are thousands of Israelis who've turned out for this protest, blocking off an entire strip. This is the culmination of a day of action right across the country, not only in cities like Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, but in smaller locations as well.
And there's a lot of, anger and resistance to what he's doing there, but certainly there's no signs of him showing any interest in what the rest of the world says about either moving into Gaza City or, for that matter, further incursions into the West Bank.
All right, well, Laura, let's discuss now the stoush that is unfolding between Israel and Australia. The Israeli Prime Minister thinks our Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, is weak. Just tell me about this statement he put on X this week.
Yes, he basically said that Anthony Albanese was a weak politician who had betrayed Israel and abandoned Australia's Jews. Now, this is an incredibly strong and very personal comment to be making about any other world leader, and has followed a series of escalations or deteriorations in the relationship.
All right. Well, the Prime Minister, in response to that, he was quite measured in what he said, wasn't he?
He was. He basically said, he doesn't take any of these things personally and just refused to rise to the bait of having a go back.
Well, I treat leaders of other countries with respect. I engage with them in a diplomatic way. I don't take these things personally.
But Prime Minister Netanyahu has sort of gradually been ramping up the pressure on Australia and other countries about this, and about suggesting that Australia had a, quote, anti-Israel attitude. And it's not entirely clear why he thinks this is a good manoeuvre. Apart from anything else, in Australia, we tend to have always taken all of these things very personally, and if some foreign figure has criticised Australia or the Australian government, it's gone straight in to be red meat into the Australian political debate. But I think it's interesting now that there's been this combination of things happen. One, I think the Prime Minister's now got his bearings and his sort of level of confidence up about dealing with foreign policy, and he's very measured in these sorts of circumstances, whether it's Israel or the US or wherever. But I think also the political mood in Australia has changed, I think, both towards Israel and also in terms of the sort of hysteria politics, if you like. I mean, some figures in the opposition have been trying to run this very hard and saying this is a gross failure on Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's part, but it has not sort of developed the momentum that it might have once done a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I was going to say the federal opposition leader, Susan Lee, she thinks or says that the relationship has been badly mismanaged.
We are seeing a relationship that has deteriorated, and the consequences of that are not good. The Prime Minister needs to explain how he is going to get this relationship that he has so badly mismanaged back on track.
But that might not be the view among the wider Australian population, you think?
Well, no. I mean, polls confirm the idea that Australians' sympathy towards Israel and warm feelings towards Israel have been really hit hard by what has occurred in Gaza over the last 22 months, no matter how terrible, the original attack might have been. But the actions of the Israeli government, as opposed to the Israeli people, have really lowered the sympathy level, if you like, towards Israel. So I think that's a really big difference. And I think just sort of saying that this is all the Prime Minister's fault doesn't really tally. It's sort of a bit of akin with the sorts of comments that, for example, Prime Minister Netanyahu makes about Gaza, which seem to be at such odds with what people are seeing with their own eyes on television every night.
Well, the Home Affairs Minister, Tony Burke, he did go a lot further than the Prime Minister in response to Netanyahu's comments.
Strength is not measured by how many people you can blow up or how many children you can leave hungry. Strength is much better measured by exactly what Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has done, which is when there's a decision that we know Israel won't like, he goes straight to Benjamin Netanyahu.
Interesting, the peak Jewish body, the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, and its head, Alex Rivkin, he's actually expressed concern about the wording by Netanyahu and by Mr Burke. He really is saying, take the heat out of this.
The Australian Jewish community is profoundly disturbed and concerned by the rapidly deteriorating state of relations between our government and the government of the State of Israel. There are serious issues to transact between the two governments, but none of this is served or advanced through this public exchange of insults that's taking place right now.
That's important, isn't it?
I think it's really important, and he's not the only leader of the Jewish community or the only Jewish association who has said these things. Now, Tony Burke was incredibly strong, and you could hear the anger in his voice when he did the interview the other morning, but Australian Jewish figures are sort of very concerned about the backlash from Prime Minister Netanyahu's comments on their own community. So, there's quite a deal of alarm about that. And in fact, somebody was telling me the other day that there had been some relief, even amongst sort of harder line, people have been very critical of the government, that the government had actually refused the visa of a far-right member of the Knesset, Mr Rothman, from coming to Australia because they were concerned that it would once again just stir up anti-Semitic sentiment in Australia, which, helps no one. So I think this was very significant. I mean, these groups, particularly the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, have been very critical of the government and of the Prime Minister for the last couple of years, saying that they haven't done enough to combat anti-Semitism. So they're not coming from a position where, they're naturally aligned, shall we say, with the government. And the fact that they've come out and said these things, I think, is telling, as is, Sam, the fact that the Israeli ambassador to Australia actually distanced himself from the Prime Minister's comments. It's pretty extraordinary.
Yeah. So just on that issue of the visa refusal for this Israeli, he's a far-right Israeli politician, Simcha Rothman. Would that have been a decision that would have angered Israel, do you think?
Well, I think the timing's been interesting. I mean, if we just go back through the timeline a little bit, things have deteriorated, shall we say, since the government announced earlier this month that Australia would be recognising the state of Palestine when the UN General Assembly is on in New York later in September. Now, other countries had done that, and Israel had been critical of those decisions, saying it played into the hands of Hamas.
To have European countries and Australia march into that rabbit hole and buy this canard is disappointing, and I think it's actually shameful.
But this decision to cancel the visa seems to have tipped Mr Netanyahu over the edge into this really extreme language. But once again, I wonder the extent to which it's playing to a domestic audience using very sort of Trumpian language and the sorts of things that we see President Trump saying to his base about foreign policy issues as well.
Well, Laura, Benjamin Netanyahu, he's now appeared in a Sky News interview in Australia where he's just doubled down on this criticism of Anthony Albanese.
But I think his record is forever tarnished by the weakness that he showed in the face of these Hamas terrorist monsters. You know, when the worst terrorist organization on earth congratulate the Prime Minister of Australia, you know something is wrong.
Interesting. All right. Well, Laura, let's then consider the history of our relationship with Israel. Of course, we've been closely associated with Israel since its founding after the Second World War. It's a really important relationship, isn't it, that Australia has?
Well, it's an important relationship, and essentially Australia played an absolutely crucial role in the founding of the State of Israel. We were the first country to vote in favour of the plan, even though the UK asked Commonwealth countries to abstain, because, of course, this was about partitioning Palestine, which at that stage was a British colony. And you know, we've continued to push the case for Israel in those international forums, defended Israel when it was seen to be under sort of unfair attack from other countries. So we've had a very strong relationship with Israel going right back to its absolutely formative days. Our view of Israel has gradually changed, or our sort of approach to Israel has gradually changed as it has made further and further incursions into land originally designated for the Palestinians. But the latter-day rationale has always been, look, it's the democracy sitting in this sort of sea of non-democracies in the Middle East, and it's the only functioning state and all those sorts of things. But I think the fact that the current government in Israel is so far to the right, plus all these charges in the International Criminal Court against both Prime Minister Netanyahu and other figures in the government, that the argument that it's a democracy we have to defend also looks a bit sad at the same time.
What about then, Laura, social cohesion here? Netanyahu thinks Anthony Albanese has abandoned Australia's Jews. There has been concern about anti-Semitism in Australia. Could this be damaging?
Well, I think as we've seen from comments from the Jewish community in Australia, they don't see it that way. You know, I think you mentioned the Executive Council of Australian Jewry's comments, and they were saying that this suggestion that Mr Albanese has abandoned Australian Jews, wasn't true, wasn't the sort of language they'd use, even though they've been critical of him, and they don't think it helps.
We've expressed concerns for nearly 2 years now about some of the government's rhetoric and policies and handling of the anti-Semitism crisis. We've had serious misgivings and we've made them known, but we've never felt abandoned. We've always felt like we can speak to government and speak to the public of this country and make our case and make our appeal for a more harmonious society. But we've never felt abandoned by this government, no.
So will it come back? Will the relationship come back? The question is what happens, I think, in terms of the domestic politics of Israel and what happens post-Netanyahu. So, these are really important questions, but there's no reason to think that if Israel shows a more democratic approach in its internal affairs, and particularly if its actions in Gaza don't continue, and the West Bank for that matter, don't continue to create outrage around the world, I don't think Australians have any gripe with Israeli people.
Laura Tingle is the ABC's Global Affairs editor. This episode was produced by Sydney Peed, Grant Walter and Cinnamon Nippard. Audio production by Sam Dunn. Our supervising producer is David Cody. I'm Sam Hawley. ABC News Daily will be back again on Monday. Thanks for listening.